Okay, here is just a brief overview of my entire eyeshadow palette collection and all the palettes we'll be going through today. I'm going to put the starting number of palettes on the screen because I don't know that number right now. I'm going to count at the very end. But I'm so excited to go through all of these palettes. I'm feeling pretty ruthless today just because I really have not been wearing as much eyeshadow as I used to in years past. I just feel like I do not need this many eyeshadow palettes. Let's just start in this little corner down here, starting with the Anastasia Beverly Hills Jackie Aina palette. This is probably one of my favorite Anastasia launches ever. I'm probably going to keep this palette for a very long time. I don't use it anymore, but I do find a lot of inspiration from this palette. Next is the Morphe and Jaclyn Hill Volume 2 palette. Now, I love the Volume 1 palette. I have that in my current Makeup Memories box. Like, I don't use it because it's so old. I have not used this palette in such a long time, and looking at this color story, this is just not something I would grab for nowadays. But I think I might put this in my Makeup Memories box because I just don't see myself using it anytime soon, but I was such a big fan of Jaclyn Hill and Morphe. You know, so many good memories here. Next is the ColourPop of Quartz palette. I really do like this one. I just recently pulled it out when I was comparing some palettes to it. I want to say it was the Naked by Mario Moonlight palette, but this one does have a really nice cool tone color story, so I am going to keep this. Over here, I have the ColourPop Going Coconuts palette. Now, this is such a classic nude eyeshadow palette, so I am going to keep it. Down here, I have the Too Faced Aptly in Love palette that did come out this year. I think I only did one video with this palette. I don't really know if I see myself using it again, but because it's so new, I think I will hang on to it for at least another year. Maybe I'll get more use out of it next fall. I don't know, we'll see. This is the Sigma and Diana Saldana palette. Now, I think I'm going to declutter this one just because I kind of forget about this palette. I also don't have any kind of relationship with Diana. Like, normally I like to keep collabs if I know the person, but I just straight up don't really know her. And this is just not a palette I grab for, so I think I'm going to declutter it. Down here is the Anastasia Sultry palette, another classic eyeshadow palette. This is another one I don't think I'll ever declutter, so I will keep it. Ooh, this Morphe Going Platinum palette. I did buy this palette this year, and I really love this color story. To me, it's just like a perfect neutral palette, and these shimmering shades in here are so gorgeous. I really like the quality of it, and I like that it's a little 9-pan palette. Definitely a keep. Next is the Juvia's Place Culture palette, and I think I got this in 2023. It might have been 2022, and honestly, I don't reach for this palette because I don't really wear color like this anymore, but if I were to wear color, like, these shimmers in here are so pretty, and they really do have such a good formula. I think I am going to keep it for now just because, again, it is still pretty new in my collection. Over here, I have these 2 mini Smashbox palettes that came out this year. I believe they came out with maybe 5 or 6 different color stories, and these 2 were sent to me in PR. I do think they're fun color stories, but I just really don't see myself reaching for these. Like, if I was looking for this kind of more green color story, I'd probably grab my Natasha Denona Yucca palette just because there's more options in it. And I also don't really wear shades like this anymore, so I think I'm going to declutter these and find a good home for them, especially since they're so new. I have these 2 YSL eyeshadow quads that were sent to me in PR. I just think this packaging is absolutely stunning. The one on the left here is $200 and this one is $300. I don't really have a lot of luxury makeup in my collection, and I actually do really like the formula of these 2 palettes, so I am going to keep these. And this one on the right is a color story I wear all the time, so I can definitely see myself getting more use out of these. On here, I have one of the Huda Beauty matte cream palettes. I think these came out in 2024. Might have been 2023, I don't know, but I really don't like this palette. I really didn't like the creamy formula in here. Like, this is such an easy declutter for me because I just don't like this. Too Faced, these also came out this year. So on the left we have the Cool palette, on the right is the Warm palette, and I did a video using both of these palettes, and I actually was very impressed with the formula, especially the shimmer shades in here. They really packed a punch. I've just been really into more smaller palettes recently, and I really do enjoy the color story of the Cool Tone one, so I'm going to keep both of them. Down here I have this Viseart Coyish Dupe palette that was an impulse purchase of 2023, and I know it's an impulse purchase because I don't think about this palette. I honestly don't even want to keep it right now, and that just goes to show you that impulse purchases are like never worth it. This palette was supposed to be like an all duochrome kind of shifty shades, but a lot of these shades are just straight up shimmers and not a duochrome at all, which is very disappointing, and because this is pretty expensive. It's also my very first Viseart palette that I purchased, so it kind of leaves like a bad taste in my mouth, I think, but I know a lot of people do love their like more neutral leaning palette. I don't know, I really don't like the formula of these shades, and if I did want a colorful kind of duochrome shade, I would reach into like an Odin's Eye palette or something like that. So this one I'm going to declutter. I have another Juvia's Place palette here. This is the Afro Galactic one. So I kept the Culture palette because I like the different variety of shades you have in that one, but looking at this palette, this color story just does not make any sense to me. I'm gonna declutter this. I really just don't really like looking at this color story, honestly. Yeah, this is gonna go. Oh my goodness, the beloved Tati Beauty Volume 1 palette. Do we think Tati Beauty is coming back? I need to know your opinions. I kind of think it is, and if she launches another palette, I will buy it, don't worry. But this is the Volume 1 palette. I mean, obviously it's the only one that ever came out, but this palette is such like a gem in my collection. This is another one I don't think I'll ever declutter. I did have a comment recently, someone asked me to do a look using the nude row in this palette. If you want to see that, let me know, because I kind of want to do that because I feel like nude eyeshadow is really in right now too. But honestly, I'm keeping this palette forever. Let's go down here. So we have the Urban Decay Naked palette. Now this is the one that launched last year in 2024, so don't worry, it's not the one that's like 12 years old. I did do another video with this for my 12 days of tutorials, and in that video I had such a hard time with this palette, but honestly I regretted decluttering my first one for so many years because this was just such like a staple palette when I really got into eyeshadow. Like it was the eyeshadow palette to have, so I don't think I'll ever declutter this palette, but I didn't really enjoy using it. So honestly, this might just go in my makeup memories box. This is the What's Up Beauty Dragon Eye palette. This was one of my favorite palettes of last year. I just think the shades, the duochromes in here are absolutely stunning. So like compared to the Viseart palette that I just decluttered, I would way more want to have this in my collection, so this is an easy keep. I have a couple of the larger ColourPop mega palettes here. These are all an easy keep for me. I really like comparing palettes to these ones. So we have the Bare Necessities, and this is a neutral warm leaning palette, and then we have Your Golden, which is a lot more warm. I always think summer when I see this palette, especially with like the pops of blues in here. My ColourPop Stone Cold Fox palette that I feel like I am always comparing high-end palettes to. This one I've swatched so many times, but this is just such a good rosy, cool toned palette. I really do love this one, and honestly I think if you're new to shadow, like this is a great palette to start out with, and like you're not going to be disappointed at all. And then I have the Smoke and Roses one, which is the newest one to me. I think I've only done one video with this palette. I just get Valentine's Day vibes looking at this palette. Maybe I need to do like a little Valentine's Day look with this. So easily keeping all four of these. This is the Natasha Denona Pastel palette. I kind of love like collecting her palettes at this point. Like, you know how we used to collect Anastasia palettes? Now I collect Natasha Denona palettes. But this is a really fun one that I like to grab for in the spring, so this one's a keep. Down here is the Sigma and On Nook palette that came out in 2022. Now I honestly don't reach for this palette a lot, but I really do love On. Her and I have chatted quite a bit, so I am going to hold on to this one. I have a bunch of Anastasia palettes that let's just quickly go through all of these together because I'm pretty sure I'm keeping all of them. Anastasia Soft Glam, such a classic palette, another one I'll probably never declutter. Next is Anastasia Rose Metals. Now this is one of my favorite fall palettes. This is definitely a keep. And then we have the Anastasia Fall Romance palette. Now I think I actually decluttered this one last year, but I ended up doing kind of a UGC job with Anastasia this year, so I did get this palette back in my collection. It's honestly not my favorite color story, but I really do love the shimmers in this one, so I'm gonna keep it. We have Modern Renaissance, another classic. This one I bought in 2023 just because my other one was looking so gross. It was so old, so this one's definitely a keep. And then last is the Nouveau palette. This palette I really love for spring. Just to show you these two, so the bottom is Nouveau that I like for spring, and then the top is Rose Metals that I like for fall. Like, it's just perfect for that. All right, let's go up here. I have two Natasha Denona mini palettes. This is the newest mini eye sculpt that I have been loving, and this is the mini My Dream. Like I said, I've been really into these kind of more smaller palettes recently, and I love both of these neutral color stories, so this is a keep. Down here is the brand new Singe Beauty Galactic Visitor palette. This was sent to me in PR, and I haven't even had a chance to play with it yet. This is so freaking gorgeous, though. Congrats to Angelica. I love the different like little color stories you have in here. Let me know if you want to see a video on this palette, but of course it's a keep because I really want to dive into it. I have this little Urban Decay Moon Dust quad that I bought 2 years ago because it has 4 of the Moon Dust shadows in it, so I've really been liking to use these shades with just like some neutral matte shadows. Like I've been using these two together a lot, the new Natasha Denona eye sculpt with these as like a little topper shade. Again, I like the mini palette, so this one is a keep. Okay, next is the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette. This is such an easy keep for me. I believe this is one of Natasha's best palettes she has ever came out with. I absolutely love the this color story. I literally keep this on my makeup desk at all times because I'm always grabbing just like some kind of shadow from here. Next we have a bunch of Sigma palettes. Let me just kind of stack all of these up. We have the Beauty and the Beast one. This is probably one of my favorite Disney collabs they've done so far. Like these 6 neutral shades right here are like my jam, and I love the little pops of color with kind of more jewel tone shades. Next we have the Sigma New Mod palette. I really do love this color story from Sigma. I think it's so beautiful. It also gives me Valentine's Day vibes. We have the Cinderella palette, which is probably my second favorite Disney collab that Sigma has done. Again, I really love these kind of more taupery shades in the palette, the like kind of purple, cool tone leaning shades. Next is the Corday Rosa palette. This is such a good summer eyeshadow palette. This is the Ambiance palette. Now this is just like a more beautiful, warm tone color story. I honestly don't really get a lot of use out of this one just because I don't like to wear super warm shadow nowadays, but I have a lot of Sigma palettes. I kind of like to collect them as well. Like Sigma has a soft spot in my heart, so I'm gonna keep it. Next is, I think this is the newest palette from Sigma. It did come out earlier this year, and straight up, I don't love this color story. This is gonna sound so harsh, but I really don't think these shades like go together very well. For me, it's just like way too deep. These shades just don't really stand out to me, but I'm gonna keep it just because it's Sigma and because it's so new. I don't know, maybe one day I'll like fall in love with the shadow in here. I don't know, but I will keep it. Next is the Alice in Wonderland. I'm not a huge fan of this color story either, but I'm gonna keep it again because it's Sigma. And we have my palette with Sigma. Look at how cool my packaging looks with the lighting. But this is my untouched palette. I have 2 that are like super used, but I thought it'd be more fun to show you a pretty new one on camera. Yeah, this is my palette I created with Sigma. Of course, I'm gonna keep this until I die. Literally. Can you imagine decluttering my own eyeshadow palette? That'd be wild. Oh, this might be their newest launch. Sorry, the Little Mermaid palette. I kind of forgot about this one. I can totally tell that Sigma kind of went a different direction with this palette, and I kind of love it. It's a little more daring for Sigma, especially just looking at their other Disney collabs. Like, for example, the Alice in Wonderland versus the Little Mermaid. I just really like the intensity of these shadows more, and they also have some new formulas in this palette that I really did like. I kind of feel like I didn't give this palette enough love, but I do like this one. Okay, let's go down here. First, I have this little Urban Decay mini Naked Sin palette. This palette I do really like. It's just like the perfect beginner friendly little neutral palette that's not intimidating at all. I think I did like 2 pretty in-depth videos with this palette, but this one is definitely a keep. And then I have the one Pat McGrath palette that I have in my collection. I believe it's the Divine Rose 7. I honestly don't use this palette, but because this is the one Pat McGrath palette I own, I am gonna keep it. This palette is so freaking heavy. Like, this is definitely the heaviest palette I own. I have a bunch of Huda Beauty palettes. Let's just quickly go through all of these together. I am definitely keeping all of them, but let me show you them. Starting with the Pretty Grunge palette. This was my favorite palette of 2023. If you can't tell so far, I love my more neutral leaning palettes, and I love that this side is more neutral. This side has a little bit of mauviness to it, and it's just like the perfect mixture together. And I really do love these shimmers in here as well. Easy keep for me. Like, love this one. Next is the Naughty Nude palette. Now this one I don't really get a lot of use out of now, just because again it's a pretty warm color story and I just don't really wear super warm shadows anymore. But because it's Huda Beauty and I kind of collect her palettes now as well, I will keep it. And we have the Empowered palette. This is another very warm leaning palette with a lot of like pretty intense shades in here. I don't really get a lot of use out of this one either, but I am gonna keep it. Also, when I have a lot of palettes from a brand, I like to use them in my comparison videos, so that's also why I hang on to them. Ooh, we have the new Icy Nude palette. This literally just came out a month ago, month and a half, I don't know. Definitely keeping this. I really do love this color story. I love the icy shades in here. Like, I'm finding myself getting a lot of use out of this, even if I'm just grabbing like one shadow. This is definitely like in my top 5 of palettes that came out in 2024. And we have the Mercury Retrograde palette. Now this palette is pretty old. I don't think you can get it anymore, and I'm not the biggest fan of this color story, but because it's Huda Beauty, like I said, I use these palettes for a lot for my comparison videos, so I don't really find myself using this palette, but I am going to keep it for comparison purposes. And we have the Rose Quartz palette. This is probably like, I don't know, my second favorite palette from Huda, next to the Icy Nude. Again, I love this kind of more softer color story. Again, it leans a little bit pink in here as well. Like, these 2 shimmers right here are probably some of my favorite shimmers in my collection. Let's go up here. I have the Patrick Ta Major Dimensions 3 palette. I freaking love this palette. I get so much use out of it. It's probably one of my favorite go-to just matte palettes. I use this row of shadows all the freaking time. This palette lives on my desk. This is definitely one of my most used palettes in my collection, so of course I'm keeping it. Going up here, I have the Makeup by Mario Master Mattes The Neutrals palette that came out this year. Now that I've just gone through my Huda Beauty and my Natasha Denona palettes, I'm like, this one's kind of meh to me. It's a little bit drier than those other two brands. But because this is a newer palette in my collection and I really do like Mario as a brand, I'm gonna keep it. And then I'll just grab up here the newer one that launched this year, the Ethereal Eyes and Midnight palette. I definitely like this palette more than the Master Mattes Neutrals palette, just because this is kind of a complete palette with the mattes and the shimmers. And you can get a pretty good variety of looks out of this palette. This one is definitely a keep. I want to say we're like halfway through and I've only decluttered 6 palettes so far. Ooh, this one's a declutter, I can tell you that. This is the Huda Beauty Wild Chameleon palette. I bought this kind of impulsively probably 2 or 3 years ago now, and I just don't really use shades like this anymore. I don't want to keep it. I don't like it, so I'm going to declutter it. This is the Sigma Warm Neutrals Mini Palette. Now, I did declutter the full size of this one last year, so I like this little kind of 7-pan version, so I'm going to keep it. I'm seeing a bunch of Sigma palettes. Let's go through all of these together. It's just kind of easier to do it brand by brand. So I have 2 of their 9-pan palettes here, the Beachy and the Ivy. These are honestly kind of similar with the mixture of mattes and blue tones in these, but I do really like the formula in these palettes. I am going to keep these. And then we have a bunch of their little quads that came out in 2023, I believe, but I love these. Like I've been saying, I love a good mini palette, and these are just like the perfect little quads. These 2 are my most used. The left is tiramisu, the right is peach pie. Then you have these 2 with just like a little smidgen of color. You have the green with the caramel apple, and then a kind of more bluish gray vibe with blueberry parfait. And then the last one I have is the creme brulee. Again, I love the neutral color story with the pop of gold. So pretty. Over here, I have this Lawless, the Dreamy Dozen Volume 2 palette. I think I did one video with this palette. Honestly, I don't like this one. I know it's a neutral color story. I've been saying I love neutrals, but this one's just like, it's not it for me. I was not impressed by this at all. So even though it's brand new, I'm going to declutter this, and I can definitely find someone that will use this. This is the ColourPop That's Taupe palette. This one's just such another classic ColourPop palette. I do love this color story. This is an easy keep. I have this Lottie London palette that I received in PR, I think early 2024. I don't like it. I just don't really care for this color story. I'm also just not huge into more drugstore makeup, so I'm gonna declutter this. I have this Fantasy Cosmetica Fighter palette that I received from the Creators and Friends trip in New Orleans last year. Honestly, looking at this palette, I'm only really drawn to this shade right here, Glory. Like, I just don't see myself using any of these other shadows. And I'm also just not huge into indie makeup. It's just not my vibe. The color stories can be a little bit too much for me and just my preferences nowadays. And I just know I'm never gonna grab for this palette, so I am gonna declutter this one. Okay, are you ready for the sea of Natasha Denona palettes that I'm just gonna like quickly go through because I'm pretty sure I'm gonna keep all of these? Like I said earlier, I kind of collect Natasha Denona palettes now. I know they're super pricey, but I just love doing videos with them. I really want to do a video like ranking all of my Natasha Denona palettes. I've been wanting to do that for a while, so if you're interested in that, let me know. Just kind of rapid fire go through these. This is the Glam palette, a beautiful, softer, kind of cool tone leaning color story. I love this one. Then we have the My Dream palette that was my favorite palette of 2022. Next is a Love palette, and this is one that I've hung on to for a while because I always say it's like a really good Valentine's Day palette, but even just like thinking about it, I don't use this palette a lot, and I don't really grab for these shades. But I've been doing more Natasha Denona comparison videos, especially when she launches a new palette, so I like to hang on to her palettes for that reason as well. So while I don't see myself using this, I am going to keep it for comparisons, kind of like those Huda Beauty ones I was talking about earlier as well. Next is the Retro palette. I really do like this color story. I think it's very unique, so I'm keeping this one. Then we have the Metropolis palette. This might be the oldest palette I have from her. This is another one I don't grab for, but I am going to keep it. Then we have the Xenon palette that came out last year. This one is such a wild palette to me. It always confuses my brain just looking at all like the grayscale shades, but this one is so unique to my collection. It's an easy keep. Next is the Hypernatural Face palette, and this one came out in 2024, and I honestly kind of forgot about it. Looking at this now, the size of these pans is absolutely tiny. Like, the idea was there, but who has a contour brush that's fitting in this pan? I really only like this palette for this one shade, Dreamy, right here. I honestly might just take out this shade because it is magnetic, so you can pop it out on the back and like put this in a palette and declutter the rest of this because I'm never going to use these. Also, some of these shades were like cream shadows, and I'm just not a cream shadow person in general, but I really didn't enjoy the formula in this palette. So I actually think I'm going to declutter it but I'm gonna take this shade out and keep this one. Look at me decluttering Natasha Denona. I didn't see that coming. Next is the Biba palette. This is another palette that I don't really use anymore. It is way too warm tone for my preferences, but again, I keep it just for comparison videos. It really did come in handy when I was looking at the new mini eye sculpt palette. Next is the Retro Glam palette. This is another really fun color story. I like this one for spring, so I'm gonna keep it. And then we have the Glam Face palette in light. This one is so much better than the Hyper Natural one that I just decluttered. And then I have the Yucca palette that I mentioned earlier when I was looking at that little mini green Smashbox palette. I love this color story. I think it's so unique. These shimmers in here are some of my favorite shimmers I have, so this one's a keep. Next we have the Roxa palette that came out at the end of 2024, and this palette, honestly, I really don't like it. I don't see myself getting a lot of use out of it, but I do love the shimmers in here. I did a couple videos trying to make this palette work, and what was so frustrating is that these three shades right here look so similar on the eyes. So honestly, I don't recommend this palette, but I'm gonna keep it because it's newer, I use it for comparisons, and I love Natasha Denona. Next is the Golden palette that also came out in 2024. Definitely keeping this one. I love this more kind of golden, neutral leaning color story. And then we have the original gold palette that came first before the golden. This is kind of in the same boat as the Metropolis palette where I don't use this one. It's really, really old in my collection, but I'm gonna keep it for comparisons and for memories. And then we have the bronze palette. Now this is another one that I really don't get any use out of nowadays just because it's so warm leaning, but because it's Natasha Denona, I'm gonna keep it. And then we have the I Need a Warm palette. This one is warm leaning, but it's also more peachy leaning. So I definitely like this color story a lot more than the bronze palette. I'm definitely gonna keep this one. Ooh, let me just grab my stoned palette right here. So I actually have two of these. This is another palette that I bought in 2024, and I have been raving about it ever since. I bought this myself. I saw it on TikTok, but I actually do know the owner of this brand. Her name is Megs, and I completely fell in love with this palette this last year. It is the perfect companion palette to any neutral matte shades I have in my collection. I bought this palette less than a year ago, and I already have pan in this shade Champagne. Like, this is my #1 eyeshadow in my collection. Hands down. I get the most use out of the neutral shades in this palette. I honestly don't really use like the red, gold, or green. Not really this one either, but like the rest of them I do. And it's actually currently sold out, and I don't know when it's going to be restocked. So during Black Friday, I bought a second palette just because I really don't want to be out of this Champagne shade. Like I said, this is my favorite shadow in my collection, and I don't want to run out of it ever. I'm normally not one to buy backups of palettes, but like this was an exception for me. Definitely one of my top 5 palettes of 2024. I have these two mini Anastasia palettes that came out in 2024. Again, I love a little mini palette. I like the color stories of these, so I'm gonna keep them. And I kind of want to play with them a little bit more, and I think this palette could be kind of fun for spring. Next, we have a bunch of Odin's Eye palettes that I want to go through, so let's stack these up. Okay, so I have 2 palettes here that are completely full of their single eyeshadows, and you can see that they are pretty much completely untouched. I honestly just need to go through these and kind of swatch them and just keep and pull out the shades that I know I'm going to use, like especially just like the shimmery, kind of more neutral, whitish shades. I think those are the only ones I'd really use. I do not see myself using any of these colorful matte shades, so that'll be a project for someday, but I'm not going to declutter this just yet, but I'm definitely going to go through it very soon. Probably just keep a handful and just put them in this mini palette. It's kind of my plan. And then I have 3 of their kind of more Christmassy palettes. I think I might have dipped into 1 or 2 of these this last holiday season, but I definitely didn't use them as much as I maybe wanted to. This is a Christmas Eve palette. I really do like this color story, and I do get Christmas Eve vibes from it. Next, I have the Snow Dream palette. I do like the kind of more fun green shades in this one. I'm gonna keep it. And then I have the Merry Christmas palette. I think this is another really fun color story. I am gonna keep this one. And then I have the Jewels and Gem and Stone and Rock palette. I honestly don't really use these palettes, and these ones like never come to the top of my mind either. Again, if I want a fun green color story, I'm gonna grab my Natasha Denona Yucca. I think I could declutter both of these. I'm gonna set them in the declutter pile for now. Next, I have the Soulmane 2 Moonwish palette. Honestly, I'm just not like an indie makeup person. I'm kind of just more into my mainstream brands. And I think I only used this palette once for one video, and I think that video even kind of flopped on my channel. Like when whenever I try to use more indie palettes, like those videos just don't perform well for me. Well, I'll probably give this away at some point, and I only used it once, so it can definitely be rehomed. I have this one collab palette that was done with Judy. This palette came out with 2 other collab palettes with other influencers, but honestly, I looked at those other 2 palettes and I just knew I wasn't going to use them, so I did not keep those 2. But this one I kept because I thought it was such a pretty spring color story. I even did a video on this palette. And so because I don't have a lot of like pastel shades like this in my collection, I am going to keep this. And then I have 2 of the Angelica collab palettes. This is the Trick or Treat palette, and this gives me such Halloween vibes. I'm definitely going to keep this. And then the Little Ghost palette. This one I don't really get Halloween vibes. I guess I can kind of get ghost vibes from it. Don't know if I'm going to get a lot of use out of this, but I'm kind of just like, oh, I love these purpley shades up here. Like, how pretty are those? So I'm going to keep it for now. Oh, I forgot about this Christmas one. I knew I was missing one. This is the Hey Reindeer palette. You know, I think looking at the other Odin's Eyes ones that I kept, I don't really love this color story as much. This one doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. Like, what is this orange doing in here? I just can't really see a lot of looks being created from this palette, so I think I'm going to declutter this one. We're getting close to the end here. I have 3 Melt Cosmetics palettes. Honestly, I think these palettes are so cool. I don't really use them, but I'm probably going to keep them all. This is the Rust one. Like if I want to do a grungy look, these shades are just perfect. You know, I haven't grabbed this in a while, but I'm kind of feeling inspired by this right now. And then I have the Gemini 2 palette, and I bought this palette because I am a Gemini, so obviously I had to have it. Such a unique color story here. I love these kind of more murky green shades. I'm gonna keep this. And then we have the Dark Matter palette. Now, I hate the layout of this palette. Like, why is there so much space in between these tiny shadows? I bought this one, I think it was like 2 years ago, because I used to have the Dark Matter stack. And honestly, I kind of forgot about this palette, and I feel like I have some other neutral palettes that I love way more in my collection. I honestly think I could declutter this, but part of me just doesn't want to because it's Melt Cosmetics. Maybe this will go in my Makeup Memories box. Like, that's the point of it, right? I have these 3 Catrice eyeshadow palettes that I received in PR earlier this year. I believe I did one video and I used the Safari Fever palette, and it was kind of cool because these palettes are only $10, which is so cheap for a whole palette. But like, I just have so many other palettes that I love so much more than these in my collection, and I really just don't think I'm gonna get any use out of these, so I'm gonna declutter all 3. Down here, I have 2 more mini Sigma 7-pan palettes. I kept the full sizes of these, and I'm going to keep these mini ones as well. I have 2 of the Michaela and Glamlight palette. Now, as much as I might not be a fan of Michaela and how she does her business, she makes a freaking good eyeshadow palette. If I ever want to do a purple or green look, I grab for this palette. There was a time where I just loved purple and green shadows together. These are nice shadows. Like, I really do love this color story and find myself grabbing for it just like sporadically throughout the year. This one I don't really grab for or think about as much. A lot of these shades are a bit too bright than what I like to use nowadays. I'm kind of looking at this top row of shadows and I'm like, oh, this is kind of nice too. But I'm definitely going to keep both of these. I have this little mini Ciroc palette. Now, as much as I was just saying I love mini palettes, I love neutral shadows, this palette is ridiculously overpriced, straight up. $102. I honestly cannot recommend this palette. I really don't use it, so I'm gonna declutter it. I have this little mini Makeup Forever Artist to Go palette in Wherever Walnut, and I thought this was such a cute little release from them this year. It's supposed to go with the other shades in their collection of Wherever Walnut. I thought it was a cute little palette. I actually lended this to my sister for my brother's wedding because she really liked the shades in here and she enjoyed it too, so I'm actually gonna keep this one. Over here, I have the Adept Flying Fiddles palette. Now, this is a palette I bought myself in 2024 because I wanted to try Adept Cosmetics. I have heard so many influencers, people I've talked to that just love this brand. I know people that have done collabs with the brand. I can tell you where exactly these 2 shadows are. They're in a little palette that I took out some of my favorite shimmer shades and put them in there because I liked those ones. I believe I did 2 videos with this palette trying to make it work, and honestly, I really dislike the matte formula in this palette. You also only get 4 matte shades in here, so I don't think it's a complete palette. The color story a little all over the place now that I'm looking at it, but it's like there are some pretty shades in here. I mean, I clearly pulled out 2 that I liked enough to take out. I don't know, I might go through this with those other Odin's Eye singles and just kind of pull out the shades that I actually do think I could get some use out of and maybe declutter the rest of this. This is gonna go in a different pile. And then I have some Clionadh Cosmetics shadows that again I got from Creators and Friends. I think again I'm gonna put this with those Odin's Eye shadows and just really go through and kind of maybe do like a little swatch party. Would you guys want to see that? Of me just like swatching single shadows and picking ones to keep? I don't know, but I think I'm gonna put this in that pile. I'm gonna grab these 2 palettes up here because the rest are Alter Ego. This one's kind of random down here. This is the Sigma and Beauty Bird Dream palette. Now this palette is pretty old. I really liked it when I had it, but I just don't see myself ever using this again, honestly. And it doesn't really have any special meaning to me. I also don't know Beauty Bird, so I think I can declutter this one. And then I have the Unearthly Spring Magic Palette. Now, this palette I actually did enjoy quite a bit. I think I did 2 looks with this one. I do think this is a really pretty palette for spring. I like the 2 different color stories you have in here with the more kind of pinky peach vibes. Then you have the blues going into greens. Like, it just kind of makes sense. And I did enjoy the formula, so this one I will keep. Now, the rest of these palettes are all from the brand Alter Ego. I'm just gonna stack these up here. I have all of these palettes because they do like to work with me when they create a new one, and I like to do a video where I'm comparing their palette to the palette that they're duping. Some people don't really like that this brand completely dupes other brands and their ideas, and I totally get that. But I just like to show them because the price differences are so different, and I know that some people can't afford, you know, a $65 Natasha Denona palette or a $69 Huda Beauty palette, where these palettes are around $20, I want to say. But I have so many of these, and some of these I think I can let go of. So first we have the Mist Haven palette, which is a dupe of the Huda Beauty Pretty Grunge. And then we have Sundown, which I think is their newest launch. I actually never got a chance to use this one because it was December, things were going on, but this is supposed to be a dupe of the Natasha Denona My Dream palette. I never got a chance to use this one, but I am going to hang on to it because I do love the My Dream palette, and maybe one day I'll do a comparison. This is Mirage, which is a dupe for Huda Beauty Empowered. I think I can declutter this one also because I just don't really see myself using Empowered that much. Like, why do I need the dupe version of it? Next is the Aurora palette. This one is pretty old. It's a dupe of Natasha Denona Sunrise, which I actually don't own anymore. I think I decluttered that one last year, so I'm going to declutter this one as well. Next is Shadow Kiss. This is a dupe for Natasha Denona Glam. I am going to keep this one. Then we have Dream Gaze. This is the dupe for Natasha Denona Pastel. I'm going to keep this one. Then we have Harmony. This is a dupe of Natasha Denona Retro. This one I will keep. Next is Daylight, and this is a dupe for Natasha Denona I Need a Nude. Because I love I Need a Nude so much, I am going to keep this one as well. And then we have the Sahara palette. This one's really old as well. It's a dupe of Biba, and I think I'm going to declutter this one. Next is Blooms. This is a dupe of the Love palette. I was just saying earlier, I don't really love the Love palette. I don't think I'm going to use it a lot, so I'm not going to keep this one either. Then we have the Luster palette, which is a dupe of the one Pat McGrath palette that I have. Yeah, same kind of thing. Because I don't use that Pat McGrath one that much, I don't need to keep this one either. This is the Canyon palette, and this is a dupe of Natasha Denona Bronze. Again, I don't really love the bronze color story. I don't really use these super warm shades anymore, so I'm going to declutter this. And then we have Wildwood, which is a dupe of Natasha Denona Yucca. I love the Yucca palette, and I kind of prefer how that palette is arranged, so I think I'm going to declutter this one. And then we have the Sakura palette, which is a dupe of Natasha Denona Retro Glam. I'm doing this all from memory. I'm so proud of myself for like knowing these palettes and their color stories and their names, but I don't really think I need to keep this one either, so I'm going to declutter it. And then we have Goddess, which is a dupe of Natasha Denona Gold. I honestly think like these two you can't even get anymore because I'm looking at it by the packaging. Like, this is their old packaging, so I'm going to declutter this one. And then Artemis is a dupe of Natasha Denona Metropolis. I'm going to declutter this one. Like I said, I don't use Metropolis that much, so I don't need to keep this one either. And then the last palette is the Alter Ego Midsummer palette. This is a dupe of Anastasia Nouveau, and I don't really think I need to hang on to this one either, so this one I will declutter. Okay, and that is the declutter. Here are my piles I have going on here. I'm gonna put the numbers on the screen here, but these are all the palettes that I'm decluttering. I feel good about this. These are all palettes that I really just don't reach for. These three with the Jaclyn Hill Naked and the Melt palette are going in my Makeup Memories box, and then the rest of these are all palettes that I'm keeping. I kind of have them by piles the way they're like snaked around right here, but like this trail of palettes is palettes that I want to keep kind of front and center in my collection. These palettes I'm going to put on my desk because I either want to use them or I do grab for them a lot. And then this whole trail is palettes that I'm keeping, but they're going to go in my cupboard storage. So I feel really good about this declutter. It always feels good to go through all of these palettes and definitely get rid of some. Let me see. Hello. Oh, this is very helpful. Oh, a big scratch tip.